to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a public speaker, has been a corporate executive, and is the author of 3 nonfiction books: Unstoppable, Influence Unleashed, and The Power of Whole Human Leadership. The first 2 books have already been published, with The Power of Whole Human Leadership slated for release on September 10th. Her name is Victoria Pelletier, and my interview with Victoria will follow the teleportation sound. Victoria Pelletier, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
What jobs and roles have you held in the business and entrepreneurship world?
Many. I started working at age 11 and bought my first company at 20, which has always kind of been a bit of a side hustle for me. I'm truly a large corporate executive type. Took my first executive role at age 24 in the world of B2B professional services, where I have stayed ever since. Although I have continued to both build and buy businesses as my proverbial side hustle, or building what I refer to now as kind of the portfolio career for the time in my life, should I ever retire.
Feel free to introduce more about yourself to our listeners.
So I describe myself, well, one is a multi-potentialite, and that just means I have a ton of diverse interests and passions. Everything from, even my work. So although I'm professional services executive, I've also been very involved in providing mentorship, and in some cases some investment to.
Victoria, did I lose your audio?
For diversity, equity, and inclusion. Pardon me?
Your audio's cutting in and out.
Oh, I just see it says your internet is unstable. I'm in Miami Beach, where in Florida, where there have been storms, and we were flickering with power yesterday. So
okay. Yeah, I'll re-ask the previous question. Feel free to introduce more about yourself to our listeners.
Sure. So I describe myself as a multi-potentialite, and that just means I have a ton of diverse interests and passions, and you will see that in everything I do. Although I have a fairly consistent professional services executive career, I have, as I mentioned earlier, both built and bought companies. Some of them have been passion projects of mine, a Bath and Body Works company, to having monetized some of the things that I love to do, which is public speaking. And I provide both personal brand and executive coaching. But I've also had the opportunity to gain very wide exposure to a multitude of other businesses through being a mentor and sometimes investor to startup founders, most of which have been women or others from a diverse minority group. I'm very, very focused both in workplaces, community, and the world at large, focused on social justice and on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, because in many cases, I've felt like an outsider. I'm also a mom. I'm a wife. I'm a fitness fanatic. I'm a foodie and a wine lover, to round it all out.
Without spoiling too much of your nonfiction books, Unstoppable and Influence Unleashed, what are they about?
And I have a third coming out in the next month or so. The first one, Unstoppable, I was approached by the publishers to contribute a chapter in that book. And it's called Unstoppable: Change Makers Who Dare to Make a Difference. So I share a little bit of my personal journey or life story and what I've learned from it, and how it's entitled Courage to Live. I've overcome pretty extreme adversity particularly in my youth. So that was a chapter in that book. Influence Unleashed is a book about personal branding and how to create a strong legacy for oneself. And I decided to pen that book because, one, it's something I speak about regularly. Two, I'm known for having an incredibly strong brand, and I've been asked to coach my fellow colleagues and then also do it outside of the workplace setting. And the third book that will be coming out, as I said, in a month or so, It's called The Power of Whole Human Leadership, which is something that I strongly believe in and have embraced and evolved my own leadership style to be much more empathetic, vulnerable, authentic, transparent in how I communicate to build real, strong trust and relationships as a leader in business.
What are the easiest and hardest parts about writing books for you?
I laugh because I left a job a little over a year ago, and while I was in transition, I thought, like, now's the time. I have time and capacity. I couldn't decide between these two topics of branding and leadership, so I did them both. So I didn't realize exactly what I was signing up for, and my own choice to do so, and just in terms of the process associated with a combination of it's sort of a hybrid publishing model, and so everything from the editing process. I found the easiest was I know the content very well, so it was just getting, pen to paper, so to speak. That was probably the easier part. The hardest was all of the other pieces that in the past the publishers I'd worked with handled, from like all the different types of editing that needed to go into the book, to formatting it for publishing, to my second book this year, the whole human leadership one. I hired an illustrator to do all of the artwork, the cover and the interior, and making sure it spoke to in each chapter, the content, to audio. I recorded the audio for the books as well. So I created a home studio that my husband was a bit upset because I overtook our walk-in closet with like noise canceling panels for hours at a time. And so the process of that was just much more intense than I anticipated, and many things that I didn't even have awareness of. The need to buy, barcodes and, ISBNs, which are the unique identifier for each of the types of books, to all the different formats and ways to get it out in the world. So there was a lot of lessons learned through that, and way more time and energy than I thought, versus the easy part of it, which, as I said, was getting pen to paper.
What is something you've learned about the writing process or writing craft since you've started writing nonfiction books?
I think it's important to have some people around you, and whether that's your editor, or I also encourage people to even have a writing team to help with the narrative and how it reads. So although I said I found it somewhat easy to get, pen to digital, I should say digital paper. I'm not an actual paper girl. The making sure that it reads well, that the stories that I'm sharing, will resonate with the audience that I've targeted. And so finding, again, whether it's a writing team around you to help with that. And I did actually have, my editor is amazing, and I think he did that. And I also had another woman that helped support, some of the writing as well. That was fantastic. And also, I leveraged some people whom I trust greatly to read it and be radically candid with me. Can hurt to sometimes get tough feedback, but I think that's what makes it wonderful in terms of then producing something that will be, ideally widely read.
Are your books self-published, traditionally published, or hybrid published, or did you use different publishing methods for your books?
So the personal brand book, well, actually both of them, I should say, were hybrid. It's just that with the second book this year, I've hired an additional group to help me with broader publishing. And so that one's, I'll say, more hybrid than the first, which I relied a little bit more on self-publishing. And it was because I wanted to get an even broader reach with this next book on leadership, given I feel like both I poured my heart into and the years of experience and knowledge I have on these topics. But the second one came with really great examples of both failures and successes I've had as a leader and what I've learned. And as I said, I invested, in a designer and illustrator to really make it even that much more meaningful, which is why I went with a deeper, greater sort of hybrid solution there to reach a wider audience.
What are some of the key elements of how a personal brand is important, whether it be as an author, in the business and entrepreneurship worlds, or otherwise?
I think it is critically important for everyone to build a strong personal brand. Even my now 24-year-old son, when he was coming out of college, I encouraged in his early 20s to be focused on it so that it's somewhat established at times where you might actually need it, such as when you are searching for a job or you're looking to pivot. But I think it's important both not just in the sort of the corporate business environment. I think it's exceptionally, important from an entrepreneurial perspective. I think a lot of people think about it in the number of TikTok follows or Instagram likes that you get. And it is so much more than that. Yes, that's the traditional influencer that people think about. But I think about, again, my experience in more of a corporate setting and LinkedIn being a primary avenue that regardless of whether you're in a sales functional role or sales leadership title, we're all selling. We're selling ourselves. We're selling, the business that we work in. And just remember that people do business with people they like and they trust, and therefore they want to do business with. And so most people in the corporate world spend all of their time focused on one element of brand, which is what you do or who you do it for. And again, that's really important, but that's only one aspect of that. There's other components to brand which are really important, which humanizes you and builds that trust and connection with the audience that you're trying to connect and engage with.
What is relationship-based selling? And I'm going to pause there because I kind of misspoke there a little bit. What is relationship-based selling and how does one go about it?
Yeah. So as I just said, people do business with people they like and trust and want to do business with. And very importantly, when you're selling a product or a service. And, for your listeners, the whole, Simon Sinek viral speech around people don't just buy what you do, they do buy why you do it. And you need to build, a real authentic connection with people to do so. I find that so many commercially focused people, sales, marketing are selling a product or a service. But to do that, and I've spent a lot of years in a services-based environment. And so there's many competitors. But what stands out in terms of buying, and I spent lots of years in management consulting, and you are literally buying individuals in that, their expertise and what they bring to the table. But you're solving, clients or customers' problems, or you're helping identify that. So for me, relationship-based selling is building real relationships with people. I encourage you to build relationships from a place of care and compassion and the desire to build a relationship. Yes, there's an objective to sell something, but doing that again from a place of actually wanting to create a relationship, and then that lasts long term. And so once you've built a relationship on shared, whether it's shared interests and passions, but also the commitment to, create value for them, to understand their pain points, to do it from, again, a place of trust. Like I have told many clients, you didn't hire me to tell you what you want to hear, but what you need to hear. That in itself has built that kind of that trust, in this relationship. I find it's too transactional. It takes longer to build these kind of relationships, but then I find typically, if you've done it well, you can build these for life, so that if you move companies or pivot, you have the opportunity to connect with them later. And so that's something that particularly for hyper growth focused companies where it's quarter to quarter results, they're often not patient enough to build these kinds of relationships. And so that's how I lead my teams, and that's how I lead in business. And I have found it to be highly effective in building high, not just relationships. Many we measure on net promoter scores, but that's about, would you recommend, this company, this person, this product, this service? And so it's been highly effective in doing that, but it takes time.
What are some obstacles and challenges you've had to overcome to achieve the success you've had?
I mentioned earlier when you asked about the books, and I shared that first one, Unstoppable, I shared a journey of overcoming pretty extreme adversity. I did. I was born to a drug-addicted teenage mother who was very abusive to me. So I spent the first several years many times going into the foster care system. ultimately, I ended up being adopted by a couple that actually knew her into a lower socioeconomic position. So I had to initially put myself through school. There was no money for that. I had some scholarships. So that having overcome that adversity, and there's many other instances of that, in my lifetime, has made me extremely resilient and able to handle almost anything that comes my way. So that, would be one element that I've overcome. The other is that I'm part of the LGBTQ community. I came out as bisexual in my teens. My first marriage was to a woman. I was with her for 11 years. I gave birth to our 2 children while in that relationship. She unfortunately passed away from cancer. I'm now married to a man, but I am still very openly queer. And it's, as I mentioned, my advocacy around DEI and, underrepresented communities, this being one of those communities, I've personally faced a lot of bias and hateful things as a result of that. So that would be another. And then I guess the third I would say is just in business, I happily wear 2 different nicknames. One is the turnaround queen. The other is the CEO whisperer. The CEO whisperer is because of my relationship-based selling and my radical candor and how I build, connection. But turnaround queen is a result of working for companies and being in situations to deal just with significant transformation and being dropped into situations to turn around distressed businesses or divisions that I've been leading. And I have now been a part of 40 merger acquisition or somewhat related transactions, some for myself, many for the companies I worked for, and then many for in support of clients. Every single one of those creates challenge and adversity in terms of how we're going to move through that successfully for the people and the business impacted.
The last couple, yes, you mentioned DEI in your previous response. My last couple of questions are going to be about DEI. The first one is, what are your thoughts about right-wing political attacks in the United States? And Florida, which was where you're from, is ground zero for a lot of that, against diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with my state for that reason, or one of those reasons is that the hate part of it. I love having very healthy debates with people on all sides. I do think we have the opportunity to learn greatly from one another. I often start from a position of just fact, and fact is even if we just look in the Fortune 500 companies. There are only, of those 500 companies, 10% of them that have female CEOs. There are currently only 6 Black CEOs. When you look at venture capital, so the startup community, less than 2% of funding goes to female founders. The World Economic Forum did a study on gender pay equity. And in North America, we're the furthest ahead in that we still have 60 years to achieve pay equity. In other parts of the world, it's more than double that. So the data is where I like to start, just to say the reality is we do not have equity. There's not enough diversity in the places that really matter. So therefore, I do believe that there is a need for us to be both strategic and incredibly intentional about how we are going to drive towards more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces. That does not mean, and this is where I have a lot of conversations with more right-leaning, does not mean that there needs to be a trade-off for strong performance and merit. I believe that we just need to be looking in very different places to bring a diverse slate of candidates to the table so we can then make those choices.
And my final question is more positive about DEI than my previous one. And that's, how can one create diverse, equitable, and inclusive organizations and communities?
I think many people in hiring functions, and sadly, I think that it usually sits with HR to solve. There's now all these chief diversity officers to somehow own that for the organization. I think that's incredibly positive in that you're going to hire someone with expertise to be a leader in the business, but they don't own it. Everyone across the organization needs to be focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making it a place where we all feel like we can belong, regardless of what lived experience, sexuality, racial, all the different types of diversity that we bring to the table. And so I think we need to be focused not just on hiring diverse talent. Most of the focus is on the front door. We are going to bring more diverse people into the organization, but we don't change our policies or procedures. We don't change the way in which we talk, our actions, language, and behavior to create those inclusive environments that retains people. So what I see is that focus only on the hiring means we often see as many running out the back door as that we're bringing through the front. And so I tell leaders, period, again, I spend a lot of time talking to people or HR leaders, like the function of HR, but that we all own it and that we need to be, I have my phrase for many things, a strategic intentionality. So we need to be strategic. Again, start from a baseline, understand where you are. And it can be a horrible statistic, and let's make realistic goals in terms of how we're going to move the needle forward, and doing so with intention and building plans to create that sense of belonging, in addition to just bringing in the diversity itself through the front door. So there's no magic bullet, is what I tell them. It's hard work and it's going to take time. We all need to be committed to it.
Victoria, you were an amazing guest, and I thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Victoria was a phenomenal guest, and Influence Unleashed is a book I would definitely recommend reading if you need to build a personal brand as an author or otherwise. I also wish Victoria well with her upcoming book. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.